The hum of the empty building echoed like a whispered reminder that she was alone, utterly, painfully alone. At midnight, when the world outside slept under the blanket of darkness, Margaret Hayes, a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and quiet strength, pushed her mop across the cold tile floors of a high-rise office in Chicago, Illinois. Every swipe of the mop felt like a confession, of exhaustion, of pain, of a life that hadn't gone the way she once dreamed. She wasn't supposed to be here, working 2 jobs, hiding swollen hands behind cheap gloves and pretending she didn't hear her own stomach growl. But life rarely asked for permission before breaking a person. And on this particular night she had reached her limit. Her knees trembled, her breath grew shallow, and the weight she carried, physical, emotional, spiritual, was slowly crushing her from the inside. If you believe kindness, empathy, and second chances still matter in this world, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this reach more hearts. Margaret had once dreamt of becoming a teacher, guiding children the way her favorite mentors had guided her. But fate intervened early. Her mother's illness drained the family savings, and Margaret dropped out of college to work full-time. Years later, after her mother passed, her father fell into depression, and Margaret again became the caretaker, the provider, the one who kept the family afloat. She never complained. She only adapted, day by day, to whatever storm life threw at her. But now, with hospital bills from her father's recent surgery stacking up and the rising cost of rent suffocating her, Margaret found herself cleaning office floors until midnight, long after fatigue had wrapped itself around her bones. The office was silent except for the soft squeak of the mop and the occasional clicking of fluorescent lights overhead. Most employees had left hours ago, except one man, Jonathan Pierce, a mid-30s corporate manager known for staying late. Margaret never spoke to him beyond polite greetings. He wore perfectly pressed shirts, polished shoes, and carried an aura of someone who lived a life she could barely imagine. He was always calm, collected, typing late into the night as though deadlines were puzzles he enjoyed solving. Margaret often wondered what it felt like to live without fear of overdue bills. Jonathan never paid much attention to the cleaning staff, until tonight. As he walked out of his office, exhausted and rubbing his temples, he noticed Margaret leaning heavier than usual onto her mop handle. Her shoulders slumped, her face looked pale, and for the first time he saw more than a uniform. He saw a human being who looked heartbreakingly unwell. He paused, watching her sway slightly. She didn't notice him. She was too focused on staying upright, too determined not to faint. Jonathan hesitated, unsure if he should intervene. But something in his conscience tugged at him, a reminder that humanity mattered more than hierarchy, so he approached slowly, careful not to startle her. Margaret finally noticed movement and looked up. Her vision blurred for a moment. She expected to see an empty hallway. Instead, she saw Jonathan's concerned face studying her closely, his eyebrows knitted in worry. For a brief second, she felt embarrassment sweep through her. She didn't want anyone, especially not someone from management, to see how worn out she truly was. As Jonathan stood there, he couldn't help but reflect on how often people like Margaret went unseen. Every day he walked past polished floors that magically stayed clean, trash cans that emptied themselves, coffee stains that vanished as though by miracle. But there was no miracle, only people like her, people who worked quietly so others could move through their day unnoticed. Margaret felt lightheaded again as she bent down to wring the mop. Her hands trembled and the room spun. Jonathan instinctively reached out, offering steady support without touching her. It was a small gesture, but to Margaret it felt like the first kindness she had received all day. The silence that followed was heavy but gentle, the kind of silence that holds questions, questions Jonathan wanted to ask but didn't know how. Margaret tried to straighten and pretend she was fine. She had learned long ago that the world didn't tolerate weakness, and she had no space in her life for sympathy that didn't pay bills. But Jonathan wasn't simply observing, he was trying to understand. Margaret resumed mopping, though slowly her movements dragged down by the heaviness of her day. Jonathan remained there for a moment, watching in quiet worry. He didn't know her story, he didn't know what burdens she carried, but he could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Jonathan finally walked away, but not to leave. Instead, he made his way toward the break room. Margaret didn't think much of it until she heard his footsteps return minutes later. When she looked up again, he was standing in front of her holding a steaming cup of tea and a small plate with 2 slices of bread from the break room pantry. It wasn't a gourmet meal, but at that moment it felt like a feast. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time that night, something warm flickered across her expression, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She hadn't eaten since morning. She couldn't afford more than 1 meal most days. She tried to refuse politely, but Jonathan gently insisted she take it. The concern in his eyes wasn't pity, it was compassion. Genuine, human compassion. Margaret finally accepted and sat down on a nearby bench. As she ate, Jonathan quietly stood nearby, not wanting to intrude. He didn't bombard her with questions or make her uncomfortable. He simply made sure she wasn't alone. Something about the simplicity of that gesture broke open a soft place inside her. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth spreading through her body. Jonathan eventually asked if she was okay, his voice low and sincere. Margaret wasn't used to opening up, especially to someone in his position. But tonight, her heart felt too heavy, too tired to carry the burden in silence. So in quiet, halting words, she told him about her father, about her second job at a diner, about the bills, the exhaustion, and the ache that seemed to fill her chest every night when she walked into this building. She didn't expect sympathy. She certainly didn't expect understanding. But Jonathan listened, truly listened, not interrupting, not judging. Each word she shared felt like a piece of her pain being lifted from her shoulders. By the time she finished, she wiped away tears she didn't realize had fallen. She almost apologized for them, but Jonathan shook his head gently, letting her know she didn't have to. In that quiet, empty office, something extraordinary took place. Not romance, not charity, but human connection. A reminder that kindness still existed, even in unexpected places. Over the next weeks, Jonathan made it a point to stay a little later whenever he could. Not to supervise or interfere, but simply to be present. Sometimes he'd bring her a warm drink or a snack. Other times, he'd sit nearby, giving her silent company so she didn't have to face the long nights alone. Margaret grew stronger emotionally, knowing someone cared. Jonathan grew wiser, realizing how often people overlooked the very individuals who kept society functioning. One day, Jonathan took a step beyond occasional kindness. He spoke with upper management about improving conditions for the cleaning staff, health benefits, better pay, fewer overnight shifts. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but he pushed with quiet determination. And over time, things changed. For the first time in years, Margaret felt hope rising like morning sunlight through a window she thought had permanently closed. By spring, her father's health began improving. Margaret was able to reduce her double shifts, and though life was still far from perfect, something inside her felt lighter, more possible, and every time she crossed paths with Jonathan, she felt gratitude not just for what he had done, but for reminding her of her own worth. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world. Before we end, please drop a comment below telling us whether you believe small acts of kindness can change lives. And as the months passed, Margaret never forgot the night someone stayed late. Not because he had to, but because he simply wanted to make sure she was okay. Sometimes, the strongest stories aren't about grand gestures. They're about the quiet moments when one human heart recognizes another and chooses compassion.